Imagine sitting in a lawyer's office while your entire family watches me with barely concealed amusement because they think my grandmother gave me the worst inheritance in the room. Not the mansion, not the cash, not the company shares, not the land. Just an old hospital on the edge of town, half empty, drowning in debt, and weeks away from shutting its doors forever. That's exactly what happened to me. And when my family laughed, I almost believed them. Almost. Because what none of them knew was that hidden beneath that dying hospital was something far more valuable than money. Not gold. Not stocks. Not some secret offshore account. No. It was proof. Proof that my family empire had been built on lies. Proof that one of the heirs sitting in that room had no rightful claim to the fortune they were celebrating. Proof that a child had been switched at birth. Proof that the woman they all called cold, ruthless, and impossible to please had spent decades preparing one final move from beyond the grave. And the most terrifying part? I wasn't just uncovering my family's secrets, I was uncovering my own. Because the hospital wasn't a punishment. It wasn't a burden. It was a test. And if I failed it, I would lose everything. But if I kept digging, I wouldn't just expose a scandal. I would bring down an entire bloodline. If you've ever seen a family smile at a funeral and calculate profit in the same breath, then you already know this story is going to get dark. And trust me, by the time we get to what was hidden in the basement, you're going to understand why my grandmother left everyone else the money and left me the truth. I was 28 years old when my grandmother died. In the Carter family, death didn't just mean grief. It meant inventory. My grandmother, Margaret Carter, had built one of the most powerful private medical networks in the state. She was the kind of woman people described in lowered voices, brilliant, elegant, feared. She had started with a tiny women's clinic 40 years earlier and expanded it into a healthcare empire that included diagnostic centers, specialty practices, real estate, and a private foundation that made the family name untouchable in the city. People called her a visionary. Her children called her impossible. I had never quite known what to call her. She wasn't warm. She wasn't affectionate. She never hugged me, never praised me openly, never defended me at the dinner table when my uncles mocked my career choices, or when my cousins treated me like the family's permanent afterthought. But every now and then, when no one else was looking, she would ask me a strange question. What do people say when they think no one important is listening? I never forgot that. Because, in a family obsessed with power, appearances, and legacy, I had always been the least threatening person in the room. I wasn't in finance. I wasn't a surgeon. I wasn't running a branch of the family business. I was a licensed therapist who worked at a community counseling center and spent my evenings helping women dealing with grief, trauma, and domestic abuse. To the rest of the family, that made me soft. Useful in a vague, low-status kind of way, but irrelevant. My cousin, Jason Carter, polished and arrogant, was the heir everyone expected to rise. My uncle Robert Carter, my grandmother's oldest son, already acted like the empire belonged to him. My mother, Linda Carter, had perfected the quiet survival strategy of saying nothing, seeing everything, and pretending those were the same thing. And then there was me, unmarried, underestimated, and in their minds completely unequipped for power. So when we gathered in that mahogany-paneled office 3 days after the funeral, no one even looked at me as a serious contender. My uncle Robert sat closest to the attorney, one arm thrown over the leather chair as though he were already posing for the cover photo of a business magazine. His wife wore pearls to a will reading. Jason kept checking his reflection in the black screen of his phone. My mother sat stiff and silent, fingers tight around her purse. And me? I wore the same black dress I had worn at the funeral and tried to keep breathing. The attorney, Mr. Kessler, was an older man with tired eyes and the kind of voice that had probably delivered both wedding vows and ruin in equal measure. He opened the file. To my son, Robert Carter, I leave my controlling shares in Carter Medical Holdings. Robert exhaled slowly, trying and failing to hide his satisfaction. To my grandson, Jason Carter, I leave the Lakeshore property portfolio and all associated commercial income rights. Jason smiled like a man who had just won something he believed was already his. To my daughter, Linda Carter, I leave my personal residence on Willowcrest, including all furnishings and contents. I turned to look at my mother, who looked stunned but not happy. Just stunned. Then the attorney adjusted his glasses. And to my granddaughter, Emily Carter. The room shifted. Not because anyone expected anything meaningful, but because they expected something small enough to confirm what they already believed. A bequest of full ownership, Mr. Kessler continued, of St. Catherine's Hospital and all operational, archival, and structural assets contained therein. Silence. Then Jason laughed. Not loud. Not uncontrollably. Just enough. St. Catherine's? He said. That place is practically condemned. Robert smirked. Mother always did have a dramatic sense of humor. Even I felt my stomach drop. St. Catherine's was the family embarrassment, an old private hospital on the outskirts of the city. The building was outdated. The patient count had been declining for years. Rumors said the licensing board had already flagged portions of it for structural non-compliance. The family had been trying to quietly decide whether to shut it down or sell the land to a developer. The hospital was not an inheritance. It was a disposal problem. Jason leaned back in his chair. Well, I guess somebody had to get the dead weight. Robert turned to me with a smile so polished it felt rehearsed. Don't worry, we'll help you offload it. But Mr. Kessler hadn't finished. There is an additional clause, he said. Now everyone paid attention. St. Catherine's Hospital may not be sold, transferred, liquidated, or placed under outside management for a period of 6 calendar months from the date of probate. During that period, all authority remains solely with Emily Carter. Any family member who attempts to interfere with the operation, administration, finances, records, or ownership of the hospital will forfeit their share of any residual holdings placed in reserve under a sealed provision. This time no one laughed. Robert's face hardened first. What reserve? He said. Mr. Kessler closed the file slightly. That provision is not open for discussion today. I felt the temperature in the room change. The hospital was bad enough. But a hidden reserve? That meant my grandmother had split the estate in a way none of them fully understood. And then Mr. Kessler said the one sentence that stayed with me long after everyone had left. Your grandmother included a handwritten note with this transfer. He slid an envelope across the table. It had only 2 words on the front. For Emily, if stories about hidden family secrets and last-minute reversals pull you in, stay with me, because what I found inside that envelope changed the meaning of everything. I waited until I was alone in my car to open it. Inside was a single card in my grandmother's sharp, unmistakable handwriting. They will look where the money shines. You must look where the silence lives. Do not trust the walls that were redrawn. And do not let them close the basement. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. My grandmother had not been sentimental. She had never written anything vague, poetic, or unnecessary in her life. If she wrote those words, she meant them. That night, Robert called me twice. Jason texted once, "Don't be stupid. If you can't run it, let someone competent do it." My mother called after midnight. "Emily," she said softly. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the note in my lap. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped feeling insulted by what I'd inherited. I started feeling warned. The next morning, I drove to St. Catherine's Hospital. The building stood behind a rusted iron fence wrapped in climbing ivy, the brick facade faded and weather-beaten. It didn't look like a place where families were healed. It looked like a place where stories were buried. The parking lot was nearly empty. Inside, the lobby lights flickered overhead. A volunteer at the front desk looked surprised to see anyone under 60. The chief administrative officer, a weary woman named Evelyn Hart, met me near the elevators. "You're really here," Evelyn said. I frowned. "Shouldn't I be?" Evelyn hesitated, then gave a thin smile. "Let's just say most people assumed your family would have this place sold by next month." She led me through dim corridors, old nurses' stations, and underfunded wings still operating on loyalty more than resources. Some departments were nearly ghost towns. Others were still alive because the staff refused to let them die. And everywhere I looked, I saw not failure but neglect. Deliberate neglect. Records stacked carelessly, maintenance requests unresolved. Budget lines frozen without explanation. Renovation maps on the walls with odd sections redacted or relabeled. At the end of the tour, Evelyn unlocked an office that had once belonged to my grandmother. It was untouched. A wooden desk, a locked cabinet, a dead clock on the wall. And behind the desk, framed in shadow, a blueprinted floor plan of the hospital. I stepped closer. Something was wrong. One wing on the blueprint didn't match the building I had just walked through. More specifically, one lower structural level shown on the older drawing did not appear on the newer renovation map pinned beside it. "Evelyn," I said quietly, "was there ever another basement level?" Evelyn went still. Then she answered too fast. Not anymore. I turned. What does that mean? Evelyn looked at the closed office door before speaking again. Years ago, during a renovation, part of the lower archive level was supposedly sealed for safety reasons. Pipes, mold, foundation concerns, that's what we were told. She paused. But your grandmother never let anyone remove the old key register. My pulse kicked. The old key register? Evelyn opened the bottom drawer of the desk and pulled out a worn leather binder. Inside were numbered tags, old maintenance entries, and a brass key with a faded label. B. 2 East Archive. Restricted. I stared at it. My grandmother hadn't left me a dying hospital. She had left me a locked door. By late afternoon, I stood outside an unmarked service corridor in the East Wing. Evelyn had led me as far as she was willing to go and then quietly left, saying only, "If there's something down there, your grandmother wanted you to see it before anyone else did." The hallway smelled like disinfectant and damp stone. At the very end was a steel door painted over so many times it looked fused shut. The brass key fit. The lock clicked. Beyond it, a narrow concrete stairwell descended into darkness. I stood frozen for a moment, hand still on the knob. Every instinct told me to call someone. A contractor. A lawyer. Security. Instead, I thought of the note. Do not let them close the basement. I pulled out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and started down. The air grew colder with each step. At the bottom was another door, heavier, reinforced. Above it, barely visible beneath layers of paint, were old metal letters. Archive. B. Inside, the room stretched farther than I expected. Shelving units lined the walls, filing cabinets stood in rows. Dust thickened the air. On one side sat old reel-to-reel storage boxes and bankers' cartons labeled by year. On the far wall was a sealed records cage with a keypad that no longer had power. And in the center of the room, under a plastic cover, sat a cart of patient files dated across 3 decades. I approached slowly. What began as curiosity became dread the moment I opened the first box. Birth records. The next one, intake transfers. The next, confidential maternal files. One folder had a red strip across the top. Do not digitize. Another, special handling administration only. My hands trembled as I opened a file dated 28 years earlier. It contained 2 infant ID bands, 2 mothers' names, 1 chart with handwritten amendments, and 1 page clipped separately with a typed notation. Infant reassignment authorized under family directive. I stopped breathing. I read it again. Then again. Infant reassignment. Not clerical error. Not incomplete paperwork. Reassignment. Someone had switched a baby. And the date on the file matched my birth year. If you're still with me, this is where the story stops being about inheritance and starts becoming a weapon. I stayed underground for nearly 2 hours. I found more than one suspicious file. There were sealed maternity records with altered timestamps, anonymous payment ledgers routed through shell donors, quiet settlement agreements signed under non-disclosure, references to a physician who had resigned unexpectedly and died 6 months later in what newspapers had called an accident. But one set of documents kept pulling me back. A file coded with my family name. Inside were internal memos, signed approvals, and 2 DNA reports, one incomplete, one hidden behind a false divider in the folder. The complete report suggested something impossible. Jason Carter was not biologically connected to Robert Carter. I stared at the page until the words blurred. That alone could shatter the family's succession line. But then I found something even worse. Tucked into the back of the folder was an envelope marked only with my grandmother's initials. Inside was a handwritten note. If Emily has found this, then she knows the family built its future on one stolen beginning. She must keep reading before she decides whom to forgive. My fingers went numb. Whom to forgive? Not whom to expose. Whom to forgive. I dug deeper. One final file, nearly hidden beneath old maintenance records, contained a discharge note tied to a woman whose name I had never heard, a young mother who had delivered at St. Catherine's the same night as my grandmother's daughter. My mother. The room spun, because the implication was now unmistakable. There had been 2 babies born that night, and one of them had been moved. I didn't drive home that night. I locked the basement, took only copies, and sat in my grandmother's office until dawn with the files spread across the desk. By sunrise, I understood 3 things. First, my family had no idea how much evidence still existed. Second, my grandmother had known all of it. And third, This wasn't just about whether Jason was the wrong heir. It was about whether I myself had been raised in the wrong branch of the family. My phone buzzed at 7:13 a.m. Robert. I let it ring out. Then came a message. I'm coming to the hospital. We need to discuss transition planning. Do not make decisions without me. I looked down at the file in front of me and whispered, "You still think this is about control?" For the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of my uncle. I was dangerous to him. Robert arrived with Jason before noon, both dressed like men expecting to walk into a negotiation they had already won. I met them in the old boardroom. Robert didn't sit. "Let's not waste time. You can't manage this place. We've identified a buyer for the property. You can't sell it for 6 months," I said evenly. His jaw tightened. "Then appoint temporary management." "My grandmother forbade that too," Jason scoffed. "You don't even know what you're looking at here. This place is a black hole." I studied him. Perfect tie, expensive watch, casual cruelty. A man raised to inherit everything. A man who had no idea a single file underground could erase the story of his entire life. Robert leaned forward. "Listen carefully. Family matters are not therapy sessions. This hospital is too important to be left in amateur hands." I almost smiled. Because for once, I agreed. It was far too important. Which was exactly why I wasn't handing it back. "I'm keeping it," I said. Jason laughed. "Out of sentiment?" "Out of sentiment? No," I replied. "Out of suspicion." That shut the room down. Robert narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means the numbers don't match the damage. It means whole sections of this building were sealed without proper reporting. It means records were preserved here that should have been digitized or lawfully destroyed. It means my grandmother didn't leave me a burden. She left me a locked vault." For the first time, Robert looked unsettled. Only briefly. But I saw it. And so did Jason. That night, someone broke into my grandmother's office. Drawers were pulled open. File cabinets had been forced. The blueprint frame was smashed on the floor. But the basement key was gone from my bag because I had already moved it. I called Daniel Grant before I called the police. After hearing everything, the retired attorney was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your grandmother didn't leave you a hospital. She left you a trigger. If you're right about what's in those files, they're going to escalate." "Was she protecting me?" I asked. "No," Daniel said quietly. "She was preparing you." That distinction landed hard. I had spent my whole life wishing someone in that family would protect me. But protection made you dependent. Preparation made you powerful. If this story is pulling you in, make sure you subscribe because what happens next is where everything falls apart. Daniel came to the hospital 2 days later. Together, we reviewed the documents in a secure room, with the door locked and blackout shades drawn. Daniel's face grew more severe with every page. "This is worse than succession fraud," he said. "There are indications of falsified birth identity, medical concealment, misuse of charitable funds, and likely criminal obstruction." I sat very still. "And the baby switch?" Daniel tapped the 2 birth files. "It's real, but the full truth depends on DNA." I stared at the papers. "You think Jason isn't family?" Daniel looked up. "I think that's only half the story. We arranged quiet DNA testing using preserved records, legal channels, and 2 independent labs. The results came back 8 days later." Daniel asked me to sit before he handed me the envelope. I didn't. I tore it open standing. And then the world changed. The results confirmed that Jason was not Robert's biological son. But that wasn't the part that made me grip the edge of the table to stay upright. The second report confirmed that I was not biologically Linda's daughter. I heard the air leave my own body. Not biologically Linda's daughter. Not the overlooked niece. Not the peripheral granddaughter. Not the emotional, impractical branch of the family tree. I was the child of the other mother, the switch child, which meant my whole life, every rejection, every quiet dinner, every sense of not fully belonging had been built on a lie engineered before I could take my first breath. And somewhere in that lie was the reason my grandmother had chosen me. Not just because I was kind, not just because I was underestimated, but because out of everyone in the family, I was the only one living both inside and outside the lie. I was the rightful witness, and perhaps, in a deeper way, the rightful heir. When I confronted my mother, Linda didn't deny it. She broke. We sat in the small kitchen of the Willow Crest house, the one Linda had inherited and never seemed comfortable inside. Linda cried without elegance, without control, without the polished family restraint I had grown up with. "It was your grandmother," she whispered. "She said it was necessary. She said Robert needed a strong bloodline, and I had delivered a girl she thought would never survive the politics of this family." My voice shook. "So she switched me?" Linda covered her face. "I didn't know until later. Not that night. Not right away. But by then it was too late, and I was too weak to fight her. She told me it was better this way. Safer. Safer." I almost laughed at the cruelty of that word. There was nothing safe about growing up where love felt conditional and belonging felt borrowed. "Did you ever tell me because you loved me?" I asked. Linda looked up, destroyed. "I did love you." "That's not what I asked." Linda had no answer. The final collapse began with a board meeting. I requested an emergency review of St. Catherine's restricted archives under the authority of ownership and in conjunction with fiduciary oversight related to the family foundation. Several senior community members attended. So did 2 outside auditors. And, at Daniel's insistence, so did an investigative journalist who had been tracking irregularities in private hospital philanthropy for years. Robert arrived furious. Jason arrived defensive. I stood at the head of the table in a navy suit my family had never seen me wear. Not expensive. Not theatrical. Just sharp enough to make one point clear. I was no longer the softest person in the room. Daniel presented first. He outlined the forged records, the sealed archives, the attempts to interfere with hospital control, the inheritance clause, the charitable fund discrepancies, the legal risk. Then he stepped back, and I spoke. I did not raise my voice. That made it worse. I explained everything. The evidence. The switch. The lies. And then I revealed the DNA. The room shattered. I didn't keep the empire for revenge. I walked away from everything that was rotten, shutting down the corruption, letting the truth come to light, and ending what my family had hidden for decades. Then I returned to where it all began. St. Catherine's Hospital. Not as a burden, but as a second chance. Within a year, it became a place of healing, a free mental health center for women and children who had nowhere else to go. Because in the end, the greatest thing my grandmother left me wasn't money. It was the truth. The truth about my family. And the truth about who I really was. I hadn't been misplaced. I had been rewritten. And this inheritance, it was meant to give me something far more valuable. A chance to reclaim my identity and build something real from what was once hidden. I didn't inherit a hospital. I inherited the truth. And this time, I chose what to do with it. If this story hit you, like the video so others can find it and tell me in the comments, would you have opened that basement door?